Buenas and have a day. Todos haben zu buena hudzung estigi un otro na episode Fanachu. Ay, day. Hungen gov zawad zunakant. Sorry, I really like that song. Memorias by Chamorro. Hungen. And so today for this episode, we're going to be talking about one of the most important concepts in Chamorro culture. It is something which every Chamorro nowadays sort of speaks about and has sometimes their own differing opinions about. But it is ultimately something which speaks to a sense of community, but also a sense of balance, a sense of justice as well. And so I'm very, very excited to have with me today Dr. Olivia Quintanilla, who will be the guest for today's episode of Fanachu, who wrote a dissertation talking about Inafa'maolek, climate justice, and restoring environmental balance. And for me, I think that this is a very important way to push the conversation around Inafa'maolek, is that, everyone, as I said, uses the idea of Inafa'maolek in different ways. Sometimes it might be to talk about a family kind of coming together. Sometimes it might be about a village pooling their resources to complete a task, right? Sometimes people will use Inafa'maolek to shame others. They'll say, oh, that's not Inafa'maolek, or what this person is doing is not Inafa'maolek. But what I really enjoy hearing, though, is those such as Olivia here, who try to expand our consciousness, especially given our colonial history, to think about how Inafa'maolek might help us think about restoring a connection to nature, to the environment, and so on. And so, Sidzus Masi, Olivia, I'm so glad that you joined for this Fanachu episode.
Thanks so much for having me.
And so, put forward, if you don't mind, because one of the things that I really like to do for Fanachu is that we kind of talk about the Chamorro experience, but in sort of across the spectrum. So there's some people who come on to Fanachu and feel very strong that Wahu Chamorro, I am Chamorro. I know lots about what it means to be Chamorro. But then it's important also to highlight others who have a very different experience. Perhaps they feel less rooted, less connected. And for them, it's really about a journey of finding things. And so for what I love about Fanachu is that we can make space for everybody, whether you feel comfortable and strong in your identity, or if you have questions and you're not sure about it. And so where, in terms of your own personal relationships to the culture, would you place yourself?
Such a great question. My journey to discover my Chamorro roots was actually pretty late in life. So I was born and raised in San Diego, and all of my aunties lived in San Diego. My parents were there, and I have 6 aunties. And so I grew up just kind of bouncing around there at their houses and enjoying Chamorro food and hearing Chamorro language, and seeing my aunties and my grandma play cards around the table and would only speak Chamorro. I never really thought of myself as a Pacific Islander or Chamorro growing up because folks didn't really talk about it. My family wasn't really sitting down and having conversations with us about our identity. Just kind of hear stories here and there and through over meals and our family parties and fiesta plates, all that kind of good stuff. But yeah, I didn't really have a consciousness until I went to graduate school that studying Pacific Island culture and history was a thing, and that there was literature out there about it. When I transferred from community college to San Diego State, I actually started studying undocumented students and their experiences. AB 540 had just come out, would kind of change the landscape when it came to undocumented students and their rights and sense of belonging on campus. And so the first community and culture I really connected with was Mexican American college students in San Diego. And wasn't until I met Yana Spiritu, like my first year of grad school, and I was talking to her about my research. She was pretty familiar. And then I read one of her books where she has a chapter about Guam, and I was very shocked to see a story about Guam, and pulled her aside and, oh, my family's from there, just kind of connecting about that. She's like, oh, you can do this. Like for your dissertation, you can do research about this. Like, oh, are people, like I was very, very beginner, very naive. And I just didn't really have folks that were giving me that active knowledge besides my family, just kind of immersing me in it. And so, Yen really exposed me to Pacific Island literature, told me about you and Craig Santos Perez, kind of the first Chamorro scholars I heard about. And then I heard about Keith Camacho. And so that was really important for me to see that there was folks who shared similar cultural backgrounds as me that were out there studying this as the research and professional life. So as soon as I found that out, made a pivot and started really learning about my culture and history, and learning about the different understandings of, what it means to be Chamorro in the diaspora, and was lucky to, connect with Tiara Napati and Alfred Flores, who really, I think, empowered me to embrace my diasporic identity and to connect with my roots, even though I was in San Diego and hadn't, just hadn't been connected to the culture very much. And so one day I showed up to the Sons and Daughters of Guam Club in San Diego, and I had been planning on doing it for a couple of years. Like, oh, I'm going to go down there. So excited. But I was always nervous that I'd be judged because I don't speak the language. And my Auntie Josie, she used to be like the treasurer of the club. So I have good ties there, but I was just so nervous. So finally I went and just showed up. I'm like, oh, what are you here for? Like, I just wanted to show up and become a member. I just want to hang out, learn about our culture. And then I remember I sat down and they had me call bingo for like our first lunch. And I just became kind of thrown into the community. And so I was very grateful to have a warm welcome, but I remember feeling like a sense of shame and guilt that I wouldn't be accepted because I didn't speak the language. And I was teased a little bit and stuff like that, but overall, well, a warm welcome. And so from there, I started taking a couple of leadership roles in the community. Got involved with CHELU, Chamorro Hands and Education Links Unity in San Diego. And just got connected to more and more Chamorro folks. And so I think I really learned about our culture through them, my colleagues, my San Diego community. And it's been great to be the person in my larger family who's a little more versed in our culture and can share, cultural facts or connections and just get them excited, because a lot of folks haven't been to Guam, my younger cousins and things like that. So I feel like I definitely am still searching for my roots, but felt a sense of rootedness through just the Chamorro community near and far, who made me feel really safe and empowered to study my culture, no matter how long I hadn't studied it before. Just felt accepted and really blossomed in that. So all of the research and focus that I have now is all pretty new, but I felt like it was something I wanted to do in the academy by using this privilege and space to do research to shed light on our cultural values and things that are impacting our islands and archipelago. Yeah, a little bit about me.
Biba, Sejus Masi, thank you so much for sharing. And because, yes, for everyone watching, I mean, remember, just, especially out in the diaspora, but also in the islands, sort of transmission of stories, knowledge, all of the language, it's something that's been interrupted by changes in the 20th century. You can be the one to help get your family back into the flow of it. The one who kind of just brings a little bit more Chamorro language into things, or kind of, I always tell people around Christmas, if you feel like you can't do the Novena Niño, you can't do the whole sort of novena, just sing some Chamorro Christmas songs. Sing the Chamorro version of O Come All Ye Faithful. Be the one to kind of get your family a little bit more, a little bit more interested in these things. And so, Magov Juna, I'm so glad that you have taken on that role for your family. And so let's talk about Inafa'maolek. And so what drew you to that concept, sort of in terms of talking about your scholarship, and then what, I guess as part of that, if you don't mind kind of telling us, how would you define it, or how do you kind of think about it?
Yeah, thanks for that. So I'd say maybe 2017 or 18 is when I did a study abroad trip to Guam. It was through UCLA with Keith Camacho. And as part of that study abroad, we took a Pacific culture class, Pacific Island studies class. And at that time, again, I was kind of pivoting with my research and really just hungry for all the knowledge about our culture. And yeah, in that class, he was sharing about Inafa'maolek and what it meant, and just kind of the debates around it, interpretations. And I just felt connected to all the different definitions I heard. But my understanding from what I learned from Keith initially, Inafa'maolek is about restoring harmony and this collective concern and care for, our group kind of mindset over the individual. This idea that it's to make good, if somebody having an argument or like tension, just that genuine desire to fix things and to make sure that we are, in balance with our relationships and overall just creating a balanced life. And so when I first heard of Inafa'maolek, it connected with my just life values and the ways that I was brought up, the ways that I was raised, and the kind of values I saw in the interactions between my family members. And so it felt nice to have language for that. It was something I always connected with, identified, but I just didn't have language for it. So I think seeing that I was already living out those values, even though I was in San Diego, and that my family, who's lived in San Diego on and off since like 1960s, that they were able to demonstrate those values to me, was really powerful. At the same time, I was learning more about Guam and the history of the island, and was really always had an interest in the environment and nature. And so as I was studying the island, I would tend to read things that had to do with the geography and the ocean and our natural resources. And so I think I just saw how deeply influenced a lot of the environmental kind of activism on Guam, how influenced it was by our cultural values and a lot of the kind of language that folks were using to fight for, demilitarization of the island, and just arguing for the right to be able to decide how we're going to use our environment and natural resources, and decide if we're going to be able to protect the water on island, how all of that was grounded in this deep desire for, Chamorros as humans to care for each other and to make sure that folks are, good all around. But I also saw them caring for the environment as a way to care for humans as well. So I saw Inafa'maolek as caring for the environment and, wanting to enact a reciprocal relationship with the environment, not just for human sake, but just for the environment's sake, but also as a way to support and kind of enact Inafa'maolek to other humans. So I saw it as, just being a more nuanced interpretation. And so I think learning about Inafa'maolek at the same time that I was studying these environmental issues, I just saw the connection really strongly. And that was always kind of my lens as I was getting more deep into the environmental impact statements and just saying the different language that was used from the military, but also in the community public comments, and just saw that that was kind of the thread of the cultural comments and concerns I was seeing.
No, thank you for sharing that. I think even along with what you've kind of recounted there, it seems like a natural kind of progression in terms of when you're thinking about Inafa'maolek, right? And a core piece of that is, as you said, the reciprocity, right? And so in the same way in which a community has these reciprocal relationships, humans and our environment, we have a reciprocal relationship too. But modernity and stuff like that kind of makes us think that we have sort of a more dominating relationship over it, or sort of that you can continue to consume and use and not think about the consequences, or that very colonial idea that you can just put the consequences on somebody else on the other side of the world, and that you don't have to deal with them. And so I really think that you helping articulate it in an environmental direction, I think it really, really helps, because even just from my own sort of study of this, the colonization definitely disrupts and interferes with sort of the Chamorro connection to the land. And then we see that really kind of really, really accelerate in the 20th century, when land becomes much more precious because of militarization and displacement. And then land becomes ultimately very commodified for most Chamorros as well. And so losing sort of that connection to that idea as, that it's about something that sustains life, as opposed to something which, for some families, it's your chance for a better life. You can sell the land off and move to Vegas, something like that. And so I think it's a necessary move in that direction. And so what kind of feedback have you gotten in terms of your work from some of the groups that you mentioned, who have been pushing for environmental justice in the Marianas, demilitarization, decolonization? What kind of feedback have you gotten?
Yeah, so far, gratitude for highlighting the issues and work that folks are doing. I think that was really the purpose of my dissertation, is to shout out and to uplift the voices of the amazing activists and folks who are urgently having to protect our environment. And so I think folks really appreciate the Indigenous-centered critiques that a lot of my work brings, and bringing the connection between, the more than human life and island life, and just really making those connections more visible from a policy standpoint, and thinking about national security conversations. I think we can retell and reimagine a lot of these issues if we center the conversation from an environmental perspective first. So some of the feedback I've gotten has been that's been enlightening, and I think the direction that we have to go to make real change in an environmental way. Yeah, and my dissertation, pretty new too. So definitely open to feedback and to have more conversations.
No, I just love this perspective in general, because I think for a lot of Chamorros, there is this idea that life is possible on Guam because of the U.S. flag flying over the island. And it's sort of a repurposed version of how Chamorros, several generations ago, felt that life wasn't possible, or history wasn't possible, without Magellan colonizing and or Salvatoris bringing Christianity to the people. But this environmental, centralization is important, because life is possible in the Pacific because there's water, guahanam, guatronquinizo, because there's coconut trees. If you take it back to the very, very basics, life is possible because of these environmental resources, first of all. And the more ways that we can remind people about that, I think, are so important, because people prioritize our relationship to or our lack of a relationship to the United States sometimes, and then kind of think that that's the most important thing in the world. And it is an important thing, but you cannot sustain life on here if your aquifer is contaminated, whether by overdevelopment or militarization. And so I wanted to also sort of hear your thoughts on that too, because Guam, as we know, is a very heavily militarized space. And for many people, they don't on island, they don't make that connection. They think about the military presence as primarily something that brings jobs or money or opportunity, less about the potential environmental consequences of the presence. And so I just real quick wanted to hear kind of your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a really important angle you're taking with that question. So in my dissertation, I make the connection between some of the conversations and narratives around coral reefs and comparing that to what I think some of the similarities are with Guam and that perspective that you outlined, where some folks might feel like the military is, it's already there, it's going to be permanent. They can't really imagine life without it. And so with coral reefs, right, there's a lot of representation and dialogue about coral reef bleaching, and some of these narratives are, framing that coral reefs are going to be bleaching forever. It's too late for climate change, and just showing a lot of imagery that one would assume, oh, it's too late to really make change. And so, in a similar way that Guam could have independence, and it would be a very different dynamic, but I think we have to imagine those possibilities, and that is definitely a reality that could happen. And with coral reefs, yes, we have to be aware of the bleaching and all of the kind of violence that's happening to coral reefs through climate change and through military, violence as well. But, coral reef can regenerate if given the right conditions and enough time, right? And so we want to be aware of definitely the harms to coral reefs, but we know that if we create the conditions, it is possible for coral to regenerate and for our oceans to be in a healthier state. And so in a similar way, they both are seeking this kind of demilitarized future, where a demilitarized future is good for the environment. And so really a prerequisite for thinking about how do we address climate change, how do we make environmentally smart decisions about our resources, a demilitarized Oceania and Guam is really the only way to seriously engage with those conversations, I feel. And so in my dissertation, I'm kind of making connections between the history of human engagement to coral reefs and tracing along that same timeline how Guam's military occupation has really impacted its ability to make decisions about the resources. So if we're thinking about the future, a demilitarized Guam is one where coral reefs could have a better chance of surviving. And so I see a lot of connections between both the past, the present, and the future of those two things.
No, Sejus Masi, thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, this is it's interesting because this conversation around Inafa'maolek and bringing in militarization into it, it's in all of the different conceptualizations of Inafa'maolek that people have, I always try to just remind people sort of that there is that key to Inafa'maolek versus something that is not Inafa'maolek is reciprocity, sort of that there is a reciprocal relationship, and that there is some sort, and and a lot of times people try to argue that the relationship to the military, right? So for example, the Magahaga of Guahan said that when there was the aircraft carrier that was filled with COVID, with sailors that potentially had COVID at the beginning of the pandemic, that in the spirit of Inafa'maolek, sort of we should welcome them. And then others have said sort of that our relationship to the military, we should see this through Inafa'maolek, right? That they take care of us and we take care of them. And I always struggle with that because it's kind of like more than anything, if you're somebody who follows the local politics that are happening on Guam in terms of the governor wanting to build a hospital and the military saying, we'll give you this land back if you build us a hospital there, but if you don't build us a hospital there, then we will use it for missiles instead. And it's just sort of a reminder that, is this Inafa'maolek? Probably not, because there's not, as you were mentioning, they're an equal relationship. There's not sort of like a level of respect or reciprocity. People benefit, there's things that can happen from this relationship, but to call it Inafa'maolek is stretching it sort of. And so that's why I always try to resist when people try to extend Inafa'maolek to the military or even to tourists. When people say that, And so for those of you watching, one of the things to remember is that there's also the Chamorro value of geftau or geneftau, which just means generosity or giving. And that's not the same thing as Inafa'maolek, right? Is that, so going back to sort of the stories of, people thatching roofs, coming together to help thatch a roof in the village, you don't necessarily do it only because you're generous. You do it because of the reciprocity, that I help you, you help me. We take care of each other in this way. We both kind of make each other's lives easier by giving up our time to help each other. And it's not necessarily geftau, it's reciprocal. We're going to help each other. It's not just charity or generosity. So I do want to sort of bring that into it, because I know that somebody did just send in a comment sort of about that, asking for me to comment on thoughts on Inafa'maolek and our relationship to the US military. And so Sidzus Masi for that question. But so one thing that I'm very excited to hear more about, because I don't know much about it, is deep sea mining, mineral deposits, because this is something where conversations amongst those who are interested in decolonization, sometimes they talk about the possibility of making money off of mining these things. And, it's like this new frontier, literally. And so can you just kind of talk about this issue? And then you've also in your dissertation talk about how, it is this, there's a lot of possibility for exploitation, right? And for all of these other things which perpetuate cycles of, negative cycles of exploitation that have impacted Indigenous peoples and their resources in the past. And so can you kind of just talk about this idea of deep sea minerals, deep sea mining, and so on?
Yeah. So I'm just so fascinated in the topic because it's our deep sea, and we have a connection to maybe the more shallow surface of the ocean, but I'm interested in all the ways that folks are trying to engage with this deep sea. And a lot of folks will say it's this new frontier or undiscovered location, compare it to outer space. And so I'm just really fascinated with all the representations of the deep sea. But really the risks are that it's a kind of uncharted territory in terms of what the impacts could be from, dredging the ocean floor and putting these big machines down there, remote operated vehicles, and extracting, all these metals, gold, silver, copper, cobalt. And so we just don't know what the long-term effects will be to the environment, or what could happen with all of the debris that's, sucked up and then spit out after these operations. And so right now, there's not as many licenses that are being issued. There's not that many vehicles out there doing this work compared to, the total ocean space. But if this is green lighted to as safe and as a safe technology, and, corporations start to really seek out larger operations so they can monetize it even more, I think we're looking at some really harmful operations that are going to impact the health of our ocean long term. And so the desire to have more technology and just our disposable lifestyles of, getting new phones every year if a new phone comes out, and just all the ways that technology is kind of coming in and out of our lives. We don't really keep things that long. I'm really afraid that desire for more tech will lead to more deep sea mining licenses. And, a lot of the legal considerations around deep sea mining are pivoting on this argument that, if we don't have the communities who is connected to the deep sea location or space or nearby it even, or have, cultural ancestral connections to the deep sea, if they don't have free, prior, and informed consent about what's actually happening, or the technology or corporations who are actually doing the work, if they don't have, enough data to back up they don't have enough data or proof to show that there's not going to be any negative impact, and they shouldn't be doing this work in the first place, And so it's kind of like, oh, let's see what happens, and then we'll just deal with it after. And so that approach, I think, is very dangerous. And so I'm just really interested in the conversations and debates that are coming out of deep sea mining in this industry. And I think it's something we definitely have to have a close eye on. No pun intended, because you can't really see the deep sea, so that makes it even more dangerous when folks who have the technology to go and explore, aren't reporting back about what's going on. So we have less ability to monitor these things as well.
It's an important lesson, because some Pacific Island nations have seen the impact of selling licenses for their fishing, right? So allowing sort of multinational corporations to come in and get fish, right? And then this leads to overfishing, and it leads to sort of huge losses for these peoples. And so we've seen some Pacific Island nations kind of trying to rein that in, and realizing that sort of you may be able to make some money off of this in the short term, but in the long term, you will lose all of, you will basically lose your environment and your own possibility for sustainability in the long run. So I think that, more caution is definitely necessary in that regard. And so actually, if I wanted, I put it out into the live stream chat. If you have any questions for Dr. Olivia, put favor, Faisinha, Pegagi Halami chat, you can message me, or you can comment on any of the live streams that are going on. And if you have any knowledge on these issues as well, one of the great things that I love about Fanachu is that it can bring together people. You can share anecdotes, you can share your experiences. I saw a few people tuning in, such as Muñeca de Oro, who does great work with MCCA and other organizations. Sidus Masin, and Muñeca is also a patron of Fanachu on Patreon. Sidus Masi, Purisinapotenai, thank you for your support. And so, put favor, if you have any questions, feel free to comment. But so one thing you mentioned, Dr. Yenle Espiritu, who was also my dissertation chair when I was at UCSD in ethnic studies, and sort of a wonderful scholar, just a wonderful presence. And so definitely helped me get through some of the difficult dissertation days as well. And so, so one thing that I've noticed about your resume is that you're also very much interested in refugee studies, immigration studies. And so these are things that Chamorros traditionally sort of don't feel connected to, or don't sort of see themselves, as being connected to. And so I'm wondering, sort of, with you having that background, does it lend any sort of extra sort of critical insight into, because, for example, when I was reading through some of the stuff that you've published and some of the stuff that you've worked on, I was thinking, climate refugees is becoming something, and Chamorros, because we're on our high island, and Chamorros because your average person imagines that Guam is just kind of like a suburb of Tucson, Arizona, or something like that, and isn't an island in the Pacific, right? That sometimes we don't think that these larger trends affect us. We don't think that they're about us. But I wanted to hear sort of, how does your sort of being in those critical scholarly and community-based conversations too, how does that sort of affect your own sort of understanding of the Chamorro experience and so on?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So yeah, working with Yen directly, I think greatly influenced the kinds of critical perspectives I was able to gain and be exposed to. So I do not think I would have this critical refugees lens without her great support and advice and guidance, and just exposing me to new literature and ways of thinking. But like I said, when I started my research journey, I was thinking about undocumented students. And so at that time, I was very much thinking about immigration in that region, US-Mexico border region. So I wasn't thinking about refugee communities at that particular time. But when I started serving as a graduate student researcher, I was able to host a bunch of community events in San Diego with our refugee communities, and just became more conscious and aware of some of the concerns of refugee communities in San Diego specifically. I think it just influenced the kinds of questions I was asking around Guam and thinking about how vulnerable the island is to kind of the wishes, the needs of the military. And so the Critical Refugee Studies Collective community helped me rethink and think more critically about displacement and how displacement happens. And even though folks might not be able to qualify for, official refugee status or meet, particular definitions given by government entities, it doesn't mean that their forced displacement or forced migration is any less, worthy of support or help. And so thinking through a critical refugee studies lens, and thinking about how, Guam has already been a space to house refugees through Operation New Life. And I think that just gives us some foreshadowing of how potentially, because Guam is a higher elevation island and perhaps sea level rise won't be the most immediate threat, although climate change is definitely impacting our coral reefs and environment in so many other ways, and definitely going to be impacted by storms and coastal erosion, but it's just operating in a different way, different timeline. And so I think thinking about how Guam could potentially be a site to house future climate refugees if the United States, wants to offer space like we saw with COVID-19 for as a safe haven, for whatever community of their choosing, that could be a possibility. But also thinking about forced displacement as, Chamorros are less able to, to have access to land like you were talking about. Less land is available, land is getting more expensive, the military is taking up more land, and so folks might be forced to migrate off island, might not be an environmental reason per se, but I think those reasons combined with the military kind of creating the conditions where folks who would normally maybe like to stay on island are slowly moving off for different reasons. And so I was thinking more critically about migration off island on Guam because of these factors, and just, rethinking how refugee life making is happening and the making of the figure of the climate refugee. I just think Guam is such an interesting space to think about climate change because of the elevation factor. And in one of my other chapters, I'm talking about the Marshall Islands and some of the unique considerations for low-lying islands when it comes to climate change and coral reef concerns. So yeah, the critical refugee studies lens, I think, helped me think about how climate refugee and just refugee life has operated across Guam throughout history, but also how it could be a future site to house refugees because of the military connection.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that connection to Operation New Life. I mean, it's interesting because, on Guam, we do have that experience of refugees, but always sort of displaced by militarization wars, sort of as part of the U.S. military sort of network. But I think that we should always just push those conversations more and kind of just get Chamorros more open to them, because, being a colonized people, but kind of having this status as being sort of like first world colonial subjects in a way. For me, it's always kind of frustrating because we don't know what's going on in the rest of the Pacific because our gaze is always fixed to the United States. And it's hard to kind of break through that. And so the conversations which are becoming more common in other Pacific islands, because the realities of being an island in a rapidly changing world, they have to deal with them. But for Chamorros, there's always kind of this, it might be a high island syndrome. You don't have to worry as much because you've got more land, you're higher from the ocean. But yeah, I think it's important to kind of bring us into those conversations, because it helps connect us to the Pacific, right? To our Pacific, Imanyat Lutanay, our brethren across the Pacific who are facing these challenges. And sometimes, but anyways, we have some questions that have come in. So I wanted to actually give us a chance to ask some of these things. And so Muñeca de Oro, Hafade Muñeca, she's mentioned that Nauru and the Cook Islands have been pushing for deep sea mineral mining. And so she says that they see this endeavor as their own national sovereign right. And so she'd like to know, what do you think about Indigenous groups that are asserting their rights like this in a capitalist framework?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks for chiming in. Yeah, I'm not up to speed on their particular, license request, but I think if folks who, are Indigenous to the communities, and if they want to make that decision, definitely still can impact other communities, right? Because we're all connected by the ocean. And so I think definitely asserting their rights over a corporation is a better way to go. But again, the technology and just the extractive nature of deep sea mining and how it's not impacting just an isolated part of the ocean. It's going to have ramifications to something. We just don't know what yet. And so I think that's a consideration that regardless of who's doing the activity, right, it could still be disastrous for our ocean. But if that's the community that's doing it, that's great. But just always evaluating the technology itself.
Hungen. No, definitely. And so we do have another question, which is very much connected to that, from Jay Pasqua. And Jay wants to know, one of the things that Indigenous populations are working on is decolonizing wealth. Do you see a way to increase wealth in the economy without negatively impacting Itanu Zenitasi, the land and the sea? And so, man, these are big questions. You guys are really challenging Olivia here. But I think that just if you have, but it is an important one, right? Because I mean, whenever I talk to people about this, I say, there's ways that we can imagine this, but we have to be willing to imagine in very radical but simple ways. So when people talk about it, I say, what would Guam's healthcare look like if I had the power to remamp it? I'd say, well, let's use the example of the Zo'amti or the Surahana, and let's start there and build off of that. And the most important thing is that the Surahana and the Zo'amti traditionally refuse to accept money when they heal somebody. And part of that is because if it's for somebody's life and health, then how could we put a price tag on it? How could we say that these many dollars or this many coins is equal to whatever you did to help that person, right? So traditionally, that type of relationship was a Tsensuli relationship between families. So I help you, but I take care of your family health-wise, and in exchange, you might come over and bring me some food, some chicken, some pigs. You might fix the roof on my house. You might do something else, but we lose something if we decide to say that this person's health and life is worth this many dollars or this. And so, but that's a difficult thing nowadays, to imagine something which isn't mitigated by money. Any thoughts that you have on that topic?
Yeah. Can you repeat the first part of the question? I just want to hear it again. Is there a way to generate wealth without extraction, or phrase it?
So talking about how to increase wealth and economy without negatively impacting the land and the sea and your resources. So Jay refers to it as decolonizing wealth. So getting rid of the idea of wealth as being just about pure money, right? Mm-hmm. Pure financial gain.
Yeah, such a good question. But I think we can think about wealth in a lot of different ways, right? There's community wealth by just having a strong community and healthy community, and so many other skill sets and resources that we can give one another, like you said, without like a monetary exchange. And so, I think there's definitely ways to do it. We just have to invest our time, resources into figuring out what those ways are, because like you said, it takes a radical reimagining. And I think, decolonizing Guam specifically would be a step in that direction to do that reimagining in practice, in real life. So I think it really starts with having control over your resources and environment and being able to make those decisions. Because without that, you're kind of trapped in this colonial capitalist system with very few ways out. So I'd say and the more imaginative ideas can actually be implemented if we have more control. Yeah, I don't have the answer to that amazing, broad, general question about how we can, still get wealth in that way, but I think it's possible. It needs a lot of collective thinking and action. It's such a great question.
No, Hungan, I agree. It's a very difficult thing to tackle because I mean, so much of our ideas, and that's why I think, Jay, the term that you use there, decolonizing wealth, is important because there's things that we accept as being kind of depoliticized, but they're actually filled with particular forms of politicization. So, for example, the idea that economy is about just kind of making more of things, right? Or in islands, the idea that economy is just about finding people to bring you money for your land, right? Or that economy is always driven by fantastically wealthy companies or people who bring things to your islands and then save you from your impoverishment. And so just kind of getting away from those types of ideas, it's difficult because they seem so commonplace, right? They seem so commonplace. It's like but trying to change that. That's why in some ways the idea of sustainability is important to add on, because it helps it can help to break us away, at least start to break us away from sort of the more modernist sort of capitalistic assumptions about growth and development, that it's all about sort of extracting, converting, and so on. But anyways, Hungen, very good questions. And so I wanted to also, because climate justice and sort of this environmental activism is something which is really, it has become so much more prominent, especially for the younger generation. I mean, you have young people who are signing up and showing up at protests for Protehi Letekzen. You have people like Protect Water Guam, or Protect Guam Water, excuse me, who, are doing great work in terms of just reminding people about how important an aquifer is on an island. Sort of that, do we want to end up becoming an island where all of our water is brought in plastic bottles? What does it take to preserve sort of the blessing that is an aquifer, a big aquifer that Guam has? And so I wanted to sort of hear your thoughts on the movements for environmental justice, climate justice, and so on. What are your thoughts on how this can help connect us both to our neighbors, but also connect it to our resources, to the land?
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think the work or the organizations that you just mentioned, right, teaching people, educating folks about the importance of an aquifer, or just how the natural environment works, right? How water flows in certain directions and why, certain sediment in the environment is going to have a negative impact on the water that water flows by. Just communicating that kind of science in that way. It's part of the climate justice movement more generally, but I think the everyday education that folks like that are doing is really critical because it allows us to have a greater consciousness about how we are all connected by our environment. Right? So there's pollution on one end of the island, it's going to impact another part of the island or the communities who traverse the whole island. So I think learning about the environment more generally gives us an awareness to then think about, okay, so how do we move to thinking about environmental justice, to climate justice, to thinking about the specifics, what I look at, which is coral reef climate justice and just the nuances where folks are having to communicate how coral reefs, as animals are working with our environment and how they're being damaged or recovering. And so the climate justice movement is advocating for some really great policy, changes and demanding action from global powers to make radical change and really offer new representations of environmental value and kind of the environmental wealth in a way that we have, and showing us the stakes of why we must protect it and urgently. And so I think a lot of the environmental policies have been problematic over time because they're usually instituted by a colonial power. But I think folks are making really great changes by asserting their demands that they want to protect the environment. So I think environmental policies, there is some optimism in that we can, reclaim that tool, I guess you would say, sometimes in order to institute long-term protections for the environment or for climate change more generally. So I think, the climate justice movement, from the everyday education to the more global protests or policy meetings, I think they're all opportunities for folks to gain an awareness about how we're connected to our environment and our neighbors, whether or not we're, on a continent or an island. I think the climate justice movement is very nuanced and spread out and diverse, but big picture, it's helping us get connected to our local communities and our global communities all at the same time, just in different ways.
Again, I mean, just from me personally, I think I love it. I love the way that these evolving and growing conversations have taken place because, even just the way it gives me a stronger sense as an islander, just because similar to when you were talking earlier, like I didn't grow up thinking of myself as a Pacific Islander necessarily, and it wasn't really until I went to grad school and people are like, "Oh, you're Pacific Islander," and I was like, "I'm not a Pacific. Oh, I guess you're right. Yeah, I guess you're right. I am a Pacific Islander." But it wasn't something that I owned or felt, right? But because of sort of the work of wonderful people who from across the Pacific, but especially the sort of those that I know from the Marianas who have been pushing for us to broaden our sense, I know more about what other islands are doing, how they're fighting back, against the rising waters, how they are giving speeches and international forums talking about the needs of the people in the Pacific and sort of fighting against the invisibility of the peoples in the Pacific. And so that's one thing that I really love about how this has come about. And I just love too that, and it's so funny because older Chamorros and older people in general sometimes don't like sort of this new emerging activism or this new sort of more openness to activism amongst the youth, especially around climate issues. But to me, I always push back and say, don't you want them to be worried about the world and try to do something to protect the world? I mean, it's really nice that you own a house, but they probably aren't going to get to own a house just because of how things are. And it's really nice that you have had a life filled with fish and coral reefs. What's going to happen a few generations from now when those things become much more sparse and scarce? And so I just love that. I just love that about all of the work that is being done. And so we have one more question that has come in though. And so within academia, how is the climate justice movement framework of the just transition being communicated and actualized? And so Sidus Masi Pudenonafanaisen, thank you so much for that question. And so have you, and I mean, you can also attack this more broadly, just in terms of how is academia kind of dealing with climate justice? And is it becoming more normalized or?
Yeah, definitely think it's becoming more well-known, and might be biased because I'm, tend to read the the articles and literature and be in the circles where folks are talking about, these great perspectives and centering Indigenous voices and climate change concerns. So yeah, now that I think about it, I might be biased because I'm surrounding myself with the communities and academic circles that are doing really great work. So yeah, I'd say I'm very optimistic because of the great work that's coming out, and a lot of folks are doing community engaged scholarship and work and trying to highlight community organizations and voices. And even some of the conferences and panels I go to, I see a lot more community organizations and partnerships. So I think there's some really great collaborative work that's happening in academia. But again, I'm trying to stick with all the great literature that's really focusing on Pacific Island voices and concerns.
No, again, I think yeah, that's one of the things that I love about sort of this podcast is just that for random people, especially tied to the Marianas on Facebook or YouTube or wherever, that if you are somebody who has, because at least this is what my experience has been, especially because of the pandemic, is that sort of there are lots of Chamorros who feel like they want to move in a particular direction, being critical about things or connecting to things, but their sort of experience as a Chamorro doesn't sort of seems disconnected from that, right? So for example, I've had many students, young people who kind of reach out and they're very liberal in their ideas. They support things like Black Lives Matter, but then they feel like their Chamorro family doesn't support those sorts of things or doesn't understand those sorts of things, right? And so that's one thing that I love about this, though, is that we can connect to these larger movements in a very Chamorro way as well, right? And for the longest time, Chamorros felt like I need to give up who I am in order to become part of something larger, and we don't need to do that anymore. There can be sort of a Chamorro focus on these sorts of things, or the experience that the Chamorro people have, the experiences that they have can lend itself to an understanding of this. We don't need to participate in our own erasure anymore. And so that's why it's great to see, people like you and others who are kind of carving out spaces for Chamorros in these larger conversations, or kind of inviting people to think in these sorts of ways. And I wanted to give you, because we're almost out of time, I wanted to give you a chance just to share any sort of final thoughts that you had. Could be about your research, or could be you could plug something if you wanted to, but whatever you would like to share before we end.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just so honored to get to participate in this space. Usually I'm doing conference panels and such where it's 15 minutes, don't go a minute over. And so it's been nice just to have this kind of free flowing conversation and to get to talk to you one-on-one. Yeah, you've been such a amazing part of my journey, and just getting to read all your work and having kind of a blueprint of what's possible. So yeah, really grateful for you. And nothing to plug. Just got a full-time job as an ethnic studies professor at MiraCosta College. So I do want to write my first book, so that's in progress. But yeah, I think the next kind of research chapter and direction I'm going, I'm really concerned with the sonar that's impacting the beaked whales and olive strandings around Guam. So really looking at that technology as well, and some of the protections that folks on Guam, even if it's just legislation that's being proposed, just seeing kind of this language that's articulating a care and concern for our beaked whales, our turtles, and bringing attention to sonar. I think this new stage and phase of my research is going to be looking more at that technology, and trying to make sure that we're just staying aware of how our marine life is being impacted by these issues, as well as how it's impacting our human populations and coral reefs. But I'm just really excited to do some more research on those connections, and hopefully can have another conversation with you some other time about what I'll be up to next.
Jus Masi Hungen, very important. Thank you so much for, being sort of that, bringing that sense of sort of community connection into your scholarly work, and sort of playing this part in terms of bringing academic and critical conversations into, not just keeping them in academic spaces. And so, si Jus Masi Talu, Olivia, thank you so much, Olivia. Purifinatomu para Fanachu. Para todos hamsuni o me ega por me ekungok si Jus Masi. Adios. Este